My name is Naoki Yoshida, and I am the producer and director for Final Fantasy XIV.
March 17th, 2014. Naoki Yoshida attends GDC in San Francisco to talk about his experience so far with Final Fantasy XIV, A Realm Reborn. During the presentation, Yoshida explained, in painstaking detail, what exactly went wrong with Final Fantasy XIV in 2010. He even went as far as to list some of the major issues 1.0 was plagued with. And yes, he did bring up the flower pots. Near the end of the presentation, an iconic slide was shown, listing what the dev team had learned from working on 1.0 and A Realm Reborn. It went as follows. Number 1. Never forget the fans. Without them, there would be no us. Number 2. Fun comes first. If it isn't fun, you're doing it wrong. Number 3. Never back down. Always aim to amaze. And number 4. Don't forget your roots. It's what fans crave. A Realm Reborn is still in its infancy. Will patch 2.2 and the following patches keep the ship afloat, or will it sink under the weight of its ever-increasing technical debt? February 27th, 2014, the A Realm Reborn PS4 beta goes live for everyone owning a PS4. This beta was completely free and introduced a whole new crowd of console players to the world of Eorzea. The beta would run in 2 phases, the last one ending on April 7th, 2014, before the planned release 1 week later on April 14th. A Realm Reborn is becoming a household name for gamers everywhere. Fewer and fewer people are aware of its previous incarnation and are now under the impression that Final Fantasy XIV is another AAA Final Fantasy game released with the subtitle A Realm Reborn. March 26th, 2014. A Realm Reborn has received its second content patch, 2.2, through the Maelstrom. In addition to the patch's poster boy Leviathan, the patch included a sea of quests including the main scenario and Hildebrand. It also saw the introduction of new beast tribes, the Kobolds and the Sahagin, as well as a new dungeon, the Lost City of Amdapor, and 2 hard mode dungeons, Halatali and Brayflox's Longstop. The second coil of Bahamut was added as well, diving deeper into the mystery of Bahamut's fate after the calamity. It was obvious the dev team had learned from their mistakes with the first coils, and the raid felt better paced. The obnoxious third turn from the first coil of Bahamut was discarded, so second coil ended up only having 4 turns. The second coil of Bahamut would reveal a shocking twist, and the last turn would take place in a location 1.0 players instantly recognized: Riven Road. This turn would become one of the hardest fights of the Binding Coils, fitting, seeing as the original fight was considered the hardest fight in the game in 1.0. Thornmarch Extreme was also included in this update and would cause endless headaches in the first few months, and to an extent still does. Extreme Primals, excluding Thornmarch, would now drop mounts, horses, or ponies as the community would come to call them, each with a flare matching the primals from which they dropped. Furnishings and gardening was added, and cottages now had basement levels. Challenge logs were added to give players weekly challenges to work towards during downtime or even while doing their regular content like roulettes and commendations. But one unique aspect of A Realm Reborn has unfortunately been lost to time: Revenant's Toll. In 2.0, that is vanilla Final Fantasy XIV A Realm Reborn, Eorzea was still recovering from the damage left behind from the calamity, and Camp Revenant's Toll was, well, destroyed. A new camp had been made with its own aetheryte close by, but it was basically just a few stalls and some closed off buildings. But this was the endgame hub, and a lot of people would spend most of their game time here in the coming years. However, the unique thing about Revenant's Toll was that for each patch, it would grow. Unfortunately, there aren't many good pictures of Revenant's Toll before the first patches when people actually realized that this was happening, but there are some, so you get an idea of how barren it was. With patch 2.1, more structures were added, and scaffolds are erected all over the place. Banners are starting to decorate the buildings built into the cliff sides, and cobblestone roads are now stretching through the camp. With patch 2.2, Revenant's Toll is starting to look more like the camp we know today. All vendors have moved to the northern side of the camp, where they remain to this day. Revenant's Toll would continue to grow until patch 2.5, when construction ceased. Revenant's Toll was complete. Unfortunately, the way this was done meant that players that joined after 2.1 had been released would never get to see the original camp or even be aware that the settlement had grown from nothing in the first place. This part of A Realm Reborn's history now only exists through the pictures players took during this period. Patch 2.2 also made significant changes to the game's new PvP system. Following its release, players voiced their dismay with the clunky systems, and this would be the first of many adjustments to Wolves' Den. A ton of dice were added: lilac purple, coral pink, cork brown, gobbybag brown, ool brown, million corn yellow, sylph green, meadow green, apple green, adamantoise green, deepwood green, celeste blue, rotano blue, corpse blue, woad blue, void blue, shadow blue, lavender blue, and colibri pink. But patch 2.2 finally introduced a whole new type of endgame content. Endgame content that became revolutionary and would change the face of Final Fantasy XIV forever. The Glamour system. Final Fantasy XIV finally had a transmog system of its own. The Glamour system would allow players to glamour other gear on top of their existing gear. This allowed characters to wear their full raid gear disguised as kawaii level 1 gear, which was also conveniently released in patch 2.2 as well. Lovely. But if you thought you'd be leveling up in style, you were out of luck. The Glamour system would only be available after hitting endgame at level 50 and completing the Glamour Unlock quest. But that's not all. To cast a Glamour, you need to use a Glamour Prism. Today, you only use a Glamour Prism called, well, Glamour Prism, but this was not the case in 2.2. Glamour Prisms were divided into 5 grades. Grade 1 for projecting the appearance of equipment at item level 1 through 20, Grade 2 for 21 to 40, Grade 3 for 41 to 60, Grade 4 for 61 to 80, and Grade 5 for 81 or above. And just to make it a little extra tedious, the prisms were further divided into 7 categories, corresponding to the type of gear you wanted to glamour: woodworking, smithing, armorcraft, goldsmithing, leatherworking, clothcraft, and alchemy. A bit of a hassle, but at least it was in the game. A lot of quality of life changes were added as well, including the option to sort the party list and the introduction of 2 new roulettes to the Duty Finder, namely the Expert and Trials roulette. However, these roulettes could only be undertaken solo at the time. But the biggest star of the show, just above the Glamour system, was the next face of the Relic questline: Atma. Just looking back at this questline makes my spine tingle. The Atma face of the Zodiac Weapon quest is infamous for forcing you to roam around aimlessly looking for fates in hopes that it would drop the item you needed. Let's break it down. The quest would have you equip your up-to-date relic, a Zenith weapon at the time, after which you would have to obtain 12 so-called Atmas. Atma of the Lion, Water-bearer, Ram, Crab, Fish, Bull, Scales, Twins, Scorpion, Archer, Goat, and Maiden. The only way to obtain these nuggets of joy was through fates. At launch, people were actually confused, as it didn't seem to drop at all. The drop rate was so low, in fact, people genuinely believed that the quest was broken and the Atmas had not been added to the loot tables of the fates. I myself spent hours in North Shroud and Lower Lenosha. Just look at the map for Lower Lenosha and the lack of an Upper Aetheryte, and you'll see why this was a particularly bad place to get stuck. And after 2 hours, I started to doubt the system myself. And that was the psychological terror of Atma farming. And it was about to get a lot worse, because it would seem a mistranslation in the quest made it seem like 2 Atmas were to drop in Central Thanalan and Central Lenosha, a place that doesn't even exist, when in fact they were not. They were meant to drop in Central Shroud and Middle Lenosha instead. This spread by word of mouth at first, with no official word from Square Enix. Was it a troll? Was it real? Are any of the drops real? As Atmas started dropping into my inventory, I did realize that it was real, but I now started doubting the quest log. A forum post popped up confirming that players had gotten the drops from the other locations. However, at this point, there were people that had farmed Central Thanalan for an Atma for hours. An Atma that was never even meant to drop there. People got a little angry. I spent weeks getting my Atma weapon with several hours a day spent trying to farm. I became a recluse in 14, desperately racing to get my relic while it was still relevant. I did get it in the end while it was still relevant, but the reward was the same relic with a different paint job, but with the glow removed. Let's just say it wasn't my favorite relic step. Overall, 2.2 was yet another massive achievement for the development team, adding tons of new features and content. This was of course a given. A Realm Reborn has a massive technical debt, and the interest is already accumulating fast. They are staying on top of it for now, and if the patches keep this level of quality in the future, the debt will be repaid in full in no time. On April 14th, 2014, the gates finally opened for PS4 players. Final Fantasy XIV enters a current-gen console market, and the shadow of the PS3 is growing. The PS4 version gets a lot of praise for its performance compared to the PS3. The game appears clearer, crisper, more responsive, but with some issues of its own. The most important part is that it really did bridge the gap between PC and console in terms of visual and gameplay quality. While the PS3 wasn't bad, it did struggle, and could barely keep a consistent 30 FPS at 720p. The PS4 could keep an almost constant 60 FPS in many zones at 1080p, so it goes without saying that's quite the upgrade. Speaking of which, if you owned a PS3 copy of A Realm Reborn, you were eligible for a free PS4 upgrade. This would replace your PS4 copy, so you would no longer be able to play your PS3 version, but hey, free upgrade. This is the point where A Realm Reborn really started to show off what it could do. This is where the vision of 14 became clear. It's here and it's here to stay. Just like its brother Final Fantasy XI, Final Fantasy XIV is now growing a dedicated community. Podcasts starts popping up. Old podcasts that ended in 1.0 are revived. The creative community we know and love today really started to bloom in this part of A Realm Reborn's life. We'll look more on the community side of things and how A Realm Reborn's storyline came to a dramatic end in the next episode. But for now, I must take my leave. Thank you so much for watching this, 9th episode of the Fall and Rise of Final Fantasy XIV. I'm thankful for all the support, and I hope you enjoyed this episode, even if it took like a year for it to come out. I'll be back in the next episode of the Fall and Rise of Final Fantasy XIV. The last one probably before we start tackling Heavensward. Until then, may you ever walk in the light of the crystal.